All right, in this part of the video, we want to just introduce some organic compound naming rules and structures. I want to emphasize this is not heavily assessed in AP Chemistry. You don't really need to know how to do naming of organic compounds, strictly speaking, but it's a useful thing to know. And then also, I don't want you to be freaked out by it if you see an organic compound. So if you see one, I want you to know that that's what it is, okay? Also, it's a good introduction to what you're going to see in a college chemistry class. So organic compounds are compounds that have carbon and hydrogen and maybe some other element in them, okay? Organic compounds can be hydrocarbons or functionalized hydrocarbons, and we'll discuss what those are a little bit. Hydrocarbons are just carbon and hydrogen atoms, so it's C with some subscript and H with some subscript, with varying numbers of each. Okay. Now the number of carbon atoms gives you the prefix. If you only have one carbon atom, the prefix will be meth, like methane, methene, methine, and so on. Okay. If it has two, it's eth, so ethane. 3 is prop, so you've heard of propane. What that means is there's 3 carbon atoms and it's single bonds. Butane, pentane, hexane, heptane, octane, nonane, and decane. So our prefixes that you see over here on the left, they are determined by the number of carbon atoms that are in a given compound. It's the subscript of carbon. Now the suffix is determined by the presence of multiple bonds, whether they're single bonds, double bonds, or triple bonds, generally by the highest number of bonds. So if it only contains single bonds, it's going to end in ane. We call those alkanes, by the way. So methane only has single bonds. Ethane only has single bonds. And then if they have double bonds, it ends in ene. Those are called alkenes. So it ends in ene. You know that means that there's at least one double bond in the compound. And then if it's got at least one triple bond in the compound, the ending will be ine. So some common hydrocarbons you've probably heard of are like methane, CH4. If you look at the structure, see how there's only single bonds in it? That's why it ends in ane. If we look at propane, all of these are single bonds. Butane, it's got 4 carbons, so that's why it's bute. And then all of the bonds in it are single bonds, so that's butane. In pentane is this one, because I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carbons, and every bond is a single bond. But in ethene, we've got a double bond. The double bond gives us that ene, and then the eth comes from the fact that we have 2 carbons. And then we have ethine, the difference being that we have a triple bond in the middle. So it's these compounds are named based on the number of carbons and whether you have single bonds, double bonds, or triple bonds in the compound. Functionalized hydrocarbons are a little more complicated, and you won't be expected to just name these on the upcoming quiz or test. Okay? But I want you to be aware of it for when you go to college or when you see these words so that you have just a general idea of what they mean or where those names come from. One of the most common functionalized hydrocarbons is an alcohol. So methanol is a type of alcohol, methyl alcohol. Okay, isopropanol, also called isopropyl alcohol, is another alcohol. And an alcohol is a hydrocarbon that it's just some hydrocarbon with a certain number of carbons and a certain number of hydrogens, but it has this OH group on the end. We've got all sorts of other types of functional hydrocarbons, like ethers. Ethers have this general format where there's an oxygen atom that branches out and you've got 2 carbon-based groups on the edges with an oxygen in the middle. That's called an ether. Aldehydes have hydrogen on one side. They've got a carbon group of some sort on the other side, and then we've got a double bond to oxygen at the top. Ketones, you've got two carbon groups that come together in kind of this triangular fashion to one carbon, and then we've got a double bond. That's called a ketone. Carboxylic acids, they kind of look like alcohols, but the difference is we have a carbon with a double bond to oxygen, and that same carbon has an OH on it, and then over on the other side is some group that has carbon and hydrogen in it. Vinegar is an example of a carboxylic acid. And then we've got esters, which are, you've got an R group, which means it's just a carbon and hydrogen group. Over on the other side is an oxygen that is then bonded to a carbon group. And then we've got a double bond to an oxygen there. And then amines have nitrogen in them. You're not expected to memorize all of this. It's more just for your information. Okay. So there's lots of different types of compounds, and you learn about all of these in organic chemistry. So if you go to organic chemistry in college, you will have to learn all of these names, but right now it's just an introduction. Okay, this is a quick study sheet that just kind of to sum up what we've talked about. Alkanes are all single bonds in the compound. An alkene, you have one double bond in the compound. Alkyne, you've got a triple bond in the compound. Your functional groups, an alcohol, you've got one O atom and all single bonds, and it's you've got that OH group in there somewhere. Ethers look like this. Okay, it's very similar to an alcohol. So if you've got one atom, one oxygen atom and all single bonds, it's either going to be an alcohol or an ether. So an alcohol would have OH. An ether has oxygen somewhere in the middle. If you got one O atom and one double bond on oxygen, it's either going to be an aldehyde or a ketone. An aldehyde has hydrogen coming off of the carbon, and a ketone has a carbon group coming off of that carbon that the double bond is attached to. And if you have two O atoms and one double bond on oxygen, that could either be a carboxylic acid. That's if there's an OH group over here. Double bond to oxygen, OH group over there. Or it's an ester if you have an O with a carbon attached to it on the other side. Okay, and an amine has nitrogen in the compound. Again, I don't want you to stress over this. It's not going to be heavily assessed, if at all. It was more just an introduction so you're aware of organic compounds. These are covalent compounds that just involve carbon and hydrogen. That's probably the most important thing I want you to be aware of, is that these compounds, they're not ionic compounds. They're covalent compounds that just have a lot of single, possibly double, possibly triple bonds between carbons and hydrogen and sometimes oxygen, nitrogen, and so on. And that's it for the Lewis structure notes and the organic chemistry notes. Go ahead and work on the practice and let me know if you have any questions.